Hello there fellow acolytes of Sega Saturn, and welcome to a Halloween edition of Saturn Gems. This time we have 5 spooky games for you. These cover a variety of different games. Some are cheap, some are expensive, some are from Japan, some are local, some are hidden gems, and others are quite well known. Anyway, let's get cracking. Here's an interesting title to start off with. We have Skeleton Warriors. Skeleton Warriors is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game, or slash-em-up game I suppose, because you use a sword. And it's based on the cartoon of the same name, where you control Prince Lightstar and you have to fight against Baron Dark and his skeletal hordes. Apart from sharing the same concept as the cartoon, the game does try to be its own thing. I was kind of expecting to have the theme music from Skeleton Warriors, which is absolutely amazing, but unfortunately it doesn't. As I say, it's a side-scrolling action game. I would put it more along the lines of something like Shinobi X and Streets of Rage. You go along with your sword and you're slashing different enemies. There's also a blocking ability which you use to block attacks, which is completely vital, and there's a bit of light platforming in there too. Although I would say that this has a lot less platforming than in something like Shinobi X, but there's still a little bit here and there. The platforming and the actual gameplay itself isn't massively innovative. It's got a variety of different locations split across the 17 different levels I think it has. But the one thing that sets it apart from other games is that it has a mechanic where when you defeat skeletons, they drop ammunition or health and you have to pick it up, because that contains their essence, their soul. And if you don't pick it up, they will start to gradually reform. It's an interesting mechanic, and it's not something that really gets old either. To help break up the game as well, there are certain hoverbike sections where it's sort of a rail shooter and you shoot down skeletons on jet bikes. It's an interesting diversion. Whilst it's not something amazingly fun, it's still a nice break from the standard action. The music and sound effects are pretty good, but there's a slight issue with that. The European version of the game has a glitch whereby most of the levels lack music. The big problem is that you'll play through these levels and apart from the sound effects, it's quite silent. And it's unfortunate because when the music does play, it's pretty good. But it plays for like the first few levels and then a couple of the levels towards the end, and that's about it. It really is a shame. If you have access to the action replay though, the American version goes for a similar price, maybe even a little bit cheaper than the PAL version, so it might even be worth picking up that version if you want to experience the game as it should have been experienced with full music. Going back to the game has a little bit of a steep difficulty curve. The first couple of worlds are actually pretty straightforward and not very difficult, although you will find that the boss encounters offer a substantial challenge even in those early levels. However, once you get a few worlds in, the difficulty starts to ramp up quite a lot. And when you're in the final area, the difficulty is pretty hardcore. The bosses, as I say, are pretty tough. The bosses have some interesting patterns and some interesting designs, and they're quite fun to figure out. Probably the standout of the game. They also include a nice little FMV sequence after when you beat it, which, whilst they're not anything special, they're still pretty cool. The game goes for about maybe 30-40 quid, so if you want to pick it up, I would say it's definitely worthwhile. Even if you want to get the glitched PAL version, it's still definitely worth picking up, and I would definitely say go for it. The next game on the list is Alone in the Dark 2. Jack is back. Alone in the Dark 2 is a survival horror game. What's interesting to note is that the Alone in the Dark series actually predated Resident Evil. Resident Evil really took survival horror to the next step and made it into quite a popular genre at the time, but the Alone in the Dark series actually came before. You take the role of Edward Carnby as he investigates gangster pirates. It's a very strange plot and a little bit silly, but to be honest, this game kind of thrives on its silliness. Even though it does kind of fit into the survival horror kind of genre in terms of how it plays, it's definitely a lot more light-hearted in its approach, and it does have a little bit more action. You still get the movement as you would expect from a survival horror game, and it contains the silly survival horror style puzzles, but in terms of the plot, the gameplay and especially the music, and it doesn't really take itself too seriously. But because it doesn't take itself seriously, the game has quite a lot of charm. The music, as I say, is a little bit silly, but it's also excellent as well. You have these jaunty pirate tunes going on in the background which play down any kind of horror elements you would expect, but nonetheless they're quite catchy and quite fun. Another reason why this is different from those kind of games is that even though it is controlled in a very survival horror way, the controls are very, very obscure. In fact, I would go as far as to say they're quite clunky. You move as a tank as you would expect. You have the A button which controls actions, B brings up your inventory menu, and C weirdly brings up the options menu. Combat as well is a little strange. When you're using guns, moving left and right will move the gun left and right as you would expect, but firing is done by holding forward. It's a little bit strange and unintuitive compared to survival horror games like Resident Evil, but again, remember this came before, so this was kind of doing its own thing and didn't really have anything else to base it off. What is even stranger though is the melee combat. To do melee combat, you hold down the action button, and holding left will move your left arm back to strike a punch. Doing the right does the same thing with the right hand, down does a kick, and up does a headbutt. I would completely advise against using hand-to-hand combat. It's honestly very, very clumsy to use and just feels strange. The guns aren't too bad, and you can usually fire those with ease, although don't expect the hit detection to be perfect. The hit detection from both you and the enemies is kind of all over the place. As well as the clunky controls, one thing which I think is probably more for the console version rather than anything is how the game feels. The game is a little bit sluggish and feels a little bit slow at times. I found that the worst part was in the gardens at the very, very beginning of the game. Screen transitions would take so long that I thought the game had frozen at first, but it's actually just the game loading the next area. That being said, as I say, the game is a lot of fun to play. If you can overlook its many flaws, you'll definitely have a fun time playing it. It also has some nice quirks in the gameplay. For example, there's at one point where you need to wear a Santa Claus outfit. There's another where you can scare a guy with a paper bag and then use a lever to slam a barrel into him, which makes him fly off the edge of the cliff. The game really doesn't take itself seriously at all, and that's kind of the strongest part of the game. It's definitely not a game for everyone, but I think if you're fans of survival horror and you can overlook the problems, you will find some fun. It's not an expensive game either. You can probably pick it up for maybe 15 quid, so it's definitely worth checking out. The next game on my list is The House of the Dead. The House of the Dead, it was originally an arcade game, and it was then ported to the Sega Saturn. It's a light gun game, but it sees you infiltrate a house that's run by the evil Dr. Curian, doing experiments to turn people into zombies. He's creating zombies and monsters and things. You have to stop him. You go into a house, you shoot the zombies and monsters, and you try to stop his evil plan while rescuing survivors. The game supports the Saturn light gun, of course, but you can also play it with the controller if you wish. Playing it with the controller though, I would say is not recommended. Unlike Virtua Cop 2 and Virtua Cop 1, the game is substantially more difficult, and if you try and play with a controller, you're going to be in for a hard time. It doesn't contain a cursor for you to actually see where you're shooting, so you have to just be a good shot. You can also blow limbs off enemies, you can blow their arms and legs off, and of course, being zombies, going for the head is generally the best option. You have a nice variety of enemies on offer, from mutant frogs to like these little leech things, and you have some quite overwhelmingly large boss type characters. The bosses in particular are quite a standout because they're quite huge in design and require some interesting tactics in order to take down. The other thing that sets this apart is some multiple paths. You can choose from multiple paths in the Virtua Cop series, but you shoot the direction that you want to go. In this it works a little bit differently, so you have to uncover secret paths and you'll head down. For example, you may rescue a hostage and he'll tell you about another route or a secret path, and the game will diverge at that point. It's quite a good system and adds a lot of replay value to the game. Because the difficulty of the game, you aren't necessarily going to get the shortcuts every time, so it means that every time you play, you'll be going down different series of routes. What's interesting to note as well is when you die, the game will show a map of the mansion and it will show the route you took. you can see all the secret routes that are available and which paths you took, and then it'll show like a little corpse where you died. It's a really nice little touch and adds to the game. The game looks really well and holds up quite well to the arcade version. The one thing that does let it down, however, is the loading times. Before certain rooms and certain areas, the game will require a load, which some people may find off-putting. Personally, I find it quite nice. It gives you a little bit of a breather in order for you to rest your arms and prepare yourself for what's going to come. The Saturn version also includes a couple of extra bonuses. There's a Saturn mode, which gives you a couple of extra characters to play as. Each one plays a little bit differently, so some of them will fire faster, they'll have stronger bullets, they'll take more damage, and it really offers a different experience to the game. There's also a boss rush mode where you can practice the bosses, or you can just take them down without having to do the levels, and you can play all the bosses one after the other if you want to really set yourself a challenge. The Western version of this game is a little bit pricey, and you may be paying a substantial amount of money for a boxed version, but the Japanese version is very cheap, and you can probably pick that up for like maybe 5-10 quid. Definitely recommended. The next game on the list is Space Hulk, Vengeance of the Blood Angels. With an epic title like that, you know you're going to go into something special. The game itself is based on the Warhammer 40k universe, which I don't really know a great deal about. I'm vaguely familiar of the Games Workshop Warhammer series, but honestly, with regards to the storyline of all these, I have no idea. In the game, you control an armoured space marine, and you need to fight the Gene Stealers. There's a campaign mode where you are a foot soldier following orders from command. As the missions progress, your superiors get killed off, and you're gradually raising in rank, and eventually you start being in charge of your own squadrons. In addition to the main campaign, there's also some side missions. There's training missions, and then there's some based on apparently famous stories in the Warhammer universe. They're a nice diversion and just offer a bit of extra content. The gameplay itself is a little strange. It's a strategy game, but you can do it from an overhead map perspective where you control where each of the Marines go to and make your orders that way. Or you can do it from a first-person perspective, where you can actually control the individual soldiers and walk your way around the map doing the various things. It's a very difficult game to get to grips with, and you may find that not only is the actual gameplay quite difficult to get a hang of, but the actual difficulty of the game itself is also quite difficult. That being said, the game does have a lot of atmosphere. Even though the levels are basically just an assortment of different corridors where you face a variety of Gene Stealers as they run up towards you and try to kill you, the game still maintains that kind of horror atmosphere of knowing that you're being surrounded by these swarms of Gene Stealers as they try to rip you apart. You have a variety of different objectives that you may have to overcome. For example, some missions just involve killing the enemy, some involve defending an area for a certain amount of time, some involve taking a bomb to a place, some involve using the flamethrower guy to burn a room, some involve just escaping. There's definitely a variety of missions on offer, and if you can take the time to actually learn how to play the game and get into it, you'll find a lot of enjoyment. The game itself is not particularly expensive. It can cost you about 15-20 quid. Whilst not being the cheapest of Saturn games, it's definitely not going to break the bank. And it's an interesting enough title where I would recommend that you buy it, play it, and see if you can get to grips with it. If you can get around the gameplay and learn how to play it properly, you'll find a game with a lot of depth in there. However, I think that for a lot of people, this game may be too complicated and too difficult for you to get your head around and find enjoyment in. It's a divisive title, sure, but if you like what you see and you like what you hear, maybe give it a pop. The final game on my list is Capcom Generations 2. Capcom Generations 2 is actually a trilogy of games in the Ghosts and Goblins franchise. You have the original Ghosts and Goblins, which is Makemura. You have Ghouls and Ghosts, which is Dai Makemura. And you have Super Ghouls and Ghosts, which I don't recall the name of, but I think it's something like Mai Dakomura. The original Ghouls and Ghosts was an arcade title, although it did see ports on different systems, such as the NES, the Atari and whatnot. Ghouls and Ghosts also got a variety of different ports, predominantly to the Mega Drive, but there were also varying different ports on like the Amiga and the Master System and the Spectrum, which all have their own variations, and Super Ghouls and Ghosts, as you can probably tell by the title, was a Super Nintendo exclusive, but it did see a later release on the Game Boy Advance. Whilst I'm talking about this game, I'm going to talk about the franchise as a whole, because you'll find that a lot of the gameplay mechanics are very similar, and then I'll briefly cover some of the differences between them. In all three of the games, they're platforming games, and you control a knight called Sir Arthur, and you rescue Princess Brin Brin. She's been kidnapped, and you go through a variety of different horrific stages as you attempt to rescue her. You have a suit of armour, but if you get hit once, you lose the armour and you end up in your underwear. You get hit again while you're in your underwear, and you die. There's also an extra level of protection, which is a super armour. You can get gold armour and green armour, which offer different weapon abilities. But again, if you get hit, you're down to your underwear. Since you can only get hit twice before you die, the game has a real challenge to it. If you lose a life, you go back to the start of the level, or sometimes a halfway point, and then if you lose your continues, you continue where you left off. The games have unlimited continues, so you can keep on playing until you reach the end, but don't think it's as easy as that. The games are one hell of a challenge, and even from the starting level, you'll find that the game is very difficult. One gimmick that happens with all three games is that you reach the end, you go to rescue Princess Brin Brin, and you find you have to pick up a special weapon and have to do all the levels again. When you go through the levels a second time, the game effectively reverts to a hard mode. The levels are super difficult, and you have to use a super shit weapon. It's unfair, sure, but it's something the games are quite famous for, and to be honest, I wouldn't have it any other way. The original game is probably the hardest of the three. It was an arcade game, which is why it's so difficult, because it wants your money, and you can jump over enemies, you can fire at enemies with your spear, or as I say, you can pick up different weapons too. You can only fire in front of you and behind you, so the movement is very limited to what you can do. In Ghouls and Ghosts, it's more or less the same. You have a single jump, but this time you can actually fire in 4 directions. In addition to firing in front of you and behind you, you can also fire up and down. Super Ghouls and Ghosts removes the ability to fire up and down, which is a shame, but it gives you a double jump. Personally, out of the 3 control styles, I think Ghouls and Ghosts is the most enjoyable. Having the ability to fire up and down certainly helps alleviate some of the difficulty. Whilst the double jump is pretty neat in Super Ghouls and Ghosts, I don't find it particularly easy to control, and I don't find it really assists in making the game any more accessible. The games have a variety of different stages, which all look beautiful. They all start with a graveyard, but then they go into different locations with each game. There are some locations that you'll find will be similar throughout the games, but they all offer their own paths in order to rescue the princess. All the levels look great, and the music is absolutely fantastic, and the enemies too are really well animated and look really good. The game probably will set you back about 50 quid if you want it, so it's not exactly the cheapest game. If you're a fan of the series, it's definitely a good way to play all 3 games on one console. All 3 of them are classic titles, and if you love games that are a challenge, I would say it's definitely worth playing. So, those are the 5 games I covered this time. We had Skeleton Warriors, Alone in the Dark 2, The House of the Dead, Space Hulk, Vengeance of the Blood Angels, and Capcom Generations 2. Those are 5 spooky games for this Halloween special. It was an interesting list to compile because a lot of the best and more well-known horror games for the Saturn I've already covered, but I think I chose a nice selection of games, and you're probably going to like some, even though maybe not all, of the games I covered. So, have you played any of them before? If so, drop a comment below, let me know what you think, and if you have any other horror suggestions for games that I've not covered either today or previously, drop them in the comments and maybe I'll cover them next Halloween. Okay, happy Halloween everyone, bye.